continue to watch the developing story in Moscow. Protests have erupted over Putin's morning speech where he threatens nuclear weapons and mobilization of troops. You're looking live there at the scene unfolding as people are being arrested. But for more on what's happening in Ukraine, we do want to take you live now to Kyiv. Our correspondent Julia Chapman is monitoring the latest in the war there. Julia.
Well, Ukrainian officials have been responding to the news from Russia today that there will be a partial mobilization, as well as these planned referendums that Russia is going to carry out in occupied regions of Ukraine. Officials here in Kyiv are saying that this is Moscow's response to its losses on the battlefield, that this is what they look like when they are in a position of weakness, and that's why these decisions have been made. They are insistent that it won't actually change the picture on the battlefield very much, at least not initially, because the reservists that are being called up in Russia will take some time to train. If they have any military experience, it will have been either long ago or relatively limited. So in the short term, not much is expected to actually change when it comes to the war in Ukraine, where fighting still continues, and Ukrainian officials are determined to continue taking back territory after recapturing vast swathes of the Kharkiv region in the last few weeks. They are still continuing to press on. There is fighting ongoing in other parts of the country on the front line, which stretches for about 1,000 kilometers, as President Vladimir Putin said in his address earlier today. They are not too alarmed either by his threat that he could use nuclear weapons. They don't believe that he is actually telling the truth. He thinks this is just an attempt to put pressure on the West to scare them into stopping their support for Ukraine. But Kyiv insistent that it is the weapons provided to Ukraine by the West that are making the difference in this war and will prevent President Vladimir Putin from taking any drastic action.
Julia Chapman live for us in Kyiv with their reaction to Putin's speech this morning. Thank you.
All right, for more on this, let's welcome in host of Dick Morris Democracy and the author of The Return, Trump's Big 2024 Comeback, Dick Morris. Also joining us, economist and political strategist and former Naval Intelligence Officer John Jordan. Gentlemen, great to have you both here.
Great to be here.
All right, John, I want to get to you real quickly and just give us some insight on these protests on the streets of Moscow. Obviously, this is a reaction to Vladimir Putin's speech and the mobilization effort of these 300,000 Russian reservists. Talk to us about what we're seeing here on screen.
Yeah, well, a lot of Russians are scared right now. When you're talking about throwing a number around like 300,000, that's like 1 in 500 Russians. And now the war is starting to touch average Russian families in a way that it hadn't before. Before, Putin had been able to say, this is something that's over there. Russian life was undisturbed. His pact with the Russian people for economic prosperity was unbroken. Now reality is starting to set in. And now we're looking at the beginning of the testing of Putin's hold on power. I don't think this is an immediate threat to it right now, but it could be. And when things in Russia start to happen, they start to happen fast. But there's an awful lot going on both in Ukraine and in Russia right now.
And Dick, we were talking about this earlier. The real question is, will Vladimir Putin use nuclear weapons? But it's not just nuclear weapons. We also have to think about an electromagnetic pulse device that he could use, or chemical weapons as well. Is there any way to know if he is bluffing or if he's serious about these types of escalations?
Basically, a question of his sanity. You'd have to ask a psychiatrist more than a military strategist. It is interesting to note that the Daily Mail says that now the 12th top-ranked Russian scientist has died in mysterious circumstances. He fell down a flight of stairs at his laboratory, and that's happening a lot. I think that the real issue here is, what does Putin do when he's backed into a corner? And clearly he's in a corner now, and we just need to see what he does.
Yeah, and John,
I'd like to take a
go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Swing at that. I'd like to take a swing at that question. Right now, looking at this militarily, any mobilization the Russians do, it's going to take months for it to be fed, to make itself felt on the Ukrainian battlefield. One of the biggest mistakes that other military analysts have made throughout this war on all networks is that they equated number of troops and quantity of equipment with combat power. And this war has demonstrated that is not the case. The Russians are not going to be able to generate through this mobilization in the relevant time frame combat power necessary to overcome Ukraine. The Ukrainians are going to probably maybe have this wrapped up a lot sooner, or at least get into a lot of these contested provinces before the Russians can bring anything to bear. That's why the use of a nuclear weapon is so scary. And using a nuclear weapon on the ground is not really a realistic option for the Russians right now because of fallout in the radioactive environment. Troops have to be specially equipped, and they have to be specially trained to operate in a nuclear environment because it's just as toxic to the using country as it is to the target country, not to mention fallout going in unpredictable directions. What the Russians may do is detonate an EMP, which is a nuclear weapon high in the atmosphere, whose physical effects do not harm anybody, harm any living thing, or really damage anything other than play absolute hell with electronics and shut down communications, water supplies, even cars and washing machines. And that's something I could see them using over Kiev because it's playing the nuclear card without any of the risks associated with it. And that's something I would watch out for if in the coming days and weeks.
And Dick, how would the Biden administration, how would NATO, how would the Europeans respond to that?
Well, we should have been hardening our facilities against an EMP, but we haven't, and Ukraine obviously has not, so they'd be very vulnerable. I think the key point here is that we have to look at the general who is winning this war, whatever happens, General Winter. And winter coming in Europe is going to be a big, big deal in terms of this war. First of all, it's a race between the Ukrainian army recapturing Ukraine with NATO weapons and NATO having its gas supplies and oil supplies cut off in the dead of the winter. And that's going to get more serious as the weather gets colder. And the pressure on NATO to crack will be enormous. There will also be huge increases in gas and oil prices throughout the world. The other thing that I think is salient here is its political impact. I hate to talk politics in the middle of something like this, but it is political. We are now 70 years, almost to the day, away from the Cuban Missile Crisis that occurred in October of '72, right before the midterm elections of 1962.
Yes,
right before the midterm elections of 1962. Kennedy mobilized the country to fight Russia putting missiles in Cuba, and it had huge impact on the elections. And I think that there is a real chance that if Biden responds effectively and dramatically with this, that this could strengthen his hand. On the other hand, it's a real test of his ability, because if he's perceived as being weak and ineffective in his response, it could undermine him. You have two leaders here, Putin and Biden, both of whom are on shaky ground domestically, high on popularity, crucial tests coming up, and a lot hinges on their ability to handle and appear aggressive and strong in the face of a crisis. And the casualty of that could be world peace, but we'll have to see. But they're both being.
And as you said, Dick, it is a zero-sum game for those two gentlemen. And based on what we heard this morning, John, how do you think the world views the United States and President Biden specifically as in terms of their ability to respond to something like we've talked about, these scenarios?
I think there's a lot of unknowns. Certainly the U.S. response we've armed the Ukrainians. We've not armed them as much as the Ukrainians wanted, or I think as well as we should have, but we did do it largely, and the world pitched in. I think the world is holding its breath now, wondering what does NATO do? What does the United States do? Do we show the resolve that we need to in this case? Had we not cut and run in Afghanistan, we would not be in this mess right now. President Trump was the only president that actually reversed President Obama and actually shipped lethal aid to the Ukrainians and reversed an Obama-era policy. Had we not cut and run in Afghanistan, this would not be happened. It's amazing. History never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. Mm-hmm. You show weakness in the face of a tyrant or an aggressive party, it only makes him more aggressive.
And John, Dick and I were talking about this earlier, how important that scene was with Donald Trump pushing, I believe it was the president of Moldova or something out of the way. The projection of strength. And sending a message directly to the Germans at the United Nations about their dependency on Russian oil, a projection of strength. The world responded to those things. Killing Qasem Soleimani, a projection of strength. The world responded. Attacking Russian mercenaries in Syria, getting too close to U.S. Special Forces troops. That is a projection of strength. We don't see any of that from President Biden. In fact, we see the opposite. Gentlemen, great to see you both. Always great to see you, Dick, as well. And get a copy of Dick's book, The Return. Learn all about 2024. We'll talk to you all soon. And, of course, we'll be watching Democracy for your next segment without me. Always enjoy seeing that, too, and learn a lot. Great to have you with us, gentlemen.
Thank you.
No crooked establishment.
None of that twisting the truth. No talking down to me.
Don't tell me how to think.
Don't tell me how to think.
Don't tell me how to think.
I trust Newsmax.
Newsmax.
They don't tell me how to think.
They let
me decide.
Newsmax.
Real news
For real people.